now.
Cecilia and I want to send our sincerest thoughts and prayers.
Thoughts and prayers.
Thoughts, prayers.
Karen and I send prayers.
The power of prayer.
Thoughts and prayers. The right thing to do is to pray in moments like this, because you know what? Prayer works.
This is who I'm making fun of when I make a joke on Twitter the day of a tragedy. The people who see something horrible happen in the world, and they run to the internet, and they run to their social media, their Facebook, their Twitter, whatever they got, and they all write down the exact same thing. My thoughts and prayers. My thoughts and prayers with the people in Aurora. My thoughts and prayers with the families in Boston. Do you know what that's worth? Fucking nothing.
Welcome to Agree or Disagree the podcast, normally dropping Wednesday on Facebook.com Kevin Olenek, Spreaker.com Kevole. You can also follow me on Twitter at Kevole, SoundCloud.com Kevole, Spreaker.com Kevole, and of course you can also subscribe on YouTube at Kevin Olenek. It is the controversial podcast that pushes you to think differently and connects you with your community. And normally we do have a podcast that drops every Wednesday, but we had to reschedule this one just to unforeseen circumstances, which happens. So today is Thursday, and this was there's one of two today. And our topic actually today is about, in both cases, thoughts and prayers. And as you heard, it is a term that we have heard countless times. You may have heard this as you have been sharing some deep struggles within your life, divorce, death, stuff like that. You may have heard them as you've reached for your goals and stuff. And you, of course, have heard them when yet another shooting, like the one last week in Parkland, Florida, where 17 students were shot, happened in the States. Thoughts and prayers. And it's the same conversation, it feels like, that we are having over and over again. Not only the conversation that is about guns, but really the conversation around prayer. Now, some perspective is insistent that it works. Another perspective is insistent that it doesn't work. Now, I have to be honest with you, and for some of the listening, and there may be some that are bothered by this statement, but I feel like I need to say it. And we're going to address this in the podcast. I am bothered and at times offended by this conversation. And I have three reasons for that, which is where we'll dig. I'm offended by the fact that at times this has been made a mockery for those who do pray. And what I mean by that is this whole idea of people praying is ridiculous. We'll dig into that a little bit. However, I'm also offended by the fact that some have used it as a very simplistic platitude and something that has impacted nothing. It has only led to hurt, harm, and disaster, which leads to number 3. And this is becoming more of a self-reflective exercise, to be honest, of my own personal understanding of prayer. Because I do it. Why do I do it, though? When do I do it? What do I get out of it? And am I praying enough into some specific situations or not? Since this incident has happened a little over a week ago, I've been compelled to dig a little bit deeper over some of the conversations that has happened. Not that I'm seeing the conversation being bad or unnecessary. It is important. But I feel like there's also some things that we need to get into. And one of these is prayer. As I said, what is it? When do we do it? Does it work? When we say the word work, which we'll also expand on, what does that mean? Our guest today is going to help us answer, and we'll have a good discussion about it. His name is Brad Jersak. He is an author and teacher based in Abbotsford, BC, where he serves as an ordained reader and a monastery preacher at All Saints for North America Monastery. He also occasionally teaches at Fresh Wind Christian Fellowship. Through his books and seminars, Brad shares the good news that God is love and perfectly revealed in Jesus Christ. He teaches others how to encounter God through the practice of listening prayer, through which love heals wounds, wounded hearts, and empowered to heal this broken world. Brad's foundational book, Can You Hear Me? Tuning into God Who Speaks, trains listeners the way of listening prayer. This book provides biblical teaching and 33 practical exercises for discerning God's voice. He also has a new book that we're also going to talk about, A More Christ-Like God. Welcome, Brad.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And just so your listeners know, the unforeseen circumstances were my bad. And so I'm really grateful that you were kind enough to reschedule for me.
Oh,
I appreciate it.
I'm excited to have you on. And I do think before we go on, I do want to make something very clear to some of the audience. I know that some are not comfortable with the idea of prayer, and I do respect that, and I thank you for that. And if it's not for you, I respect you not wanting to listen to this. But I think there is a very important conversation to have here. And I think maybe the best way to start is, what are your thoughts on this term, thoughts and prayers? And we were having a little bit of a chat out before this. We started, I hit the record button. And I think there's some important things to acknowledge. But maybe tell us a little bit about your thoughts on this term, thoughts and prayers.
Yeah, thanks for asking. I really actually resonate with your second objection around it being used as a platitude. But perhaps I would even state it more strongly. I feel like it's been used as a counterpoint to action. So, for example, the very people who are using it, let's say in the gun control debate, are the ones getting millions of dollars in contributions for the NRA. So when they're challenged on legislation around this, they deflect it using the expression thoughts and prayers. And so to me, that's not just a platitude. That's very insidious, and it's very disrespectful. And I want to even sort of say blasphemous, because when you offer thoughts and prayers as a solution to something that you have a political stake in opposing, then what are you even doing? And it's a way of saying, I care about you, but I don't give a damn about you. And so to me, I get the same triggers as that comedian. I think I'm not sure who that was, but
Anthony Jernich.
Yeah. So while I would disagree that thoughts and prayers are useless, the phrase itself is more than useless. It's disrespectful, and it misrepresents everything that someone who prays should be about. And so I would call BS on that. Our thoughts and prayers are with people who've been massacred, and yet with the ability to do something we refuse to because of a hand is in our pocket. So I find it really, really offensive. And what it does then is it takes down the whole topic, and you're like, the reaction is that thoughts and prayers are in fact useless. And that's actually not been my experience of it. But wow, the misrepresentations that come with that. No wonder.
Yeah. You can really feel that hurt. You can really, like, I would be classified myself as a pretty sensitive person, and I can really sense that. I mean, I don't think you need to be super sensitive to recognize that hurt on social media necessarily, but it just, it's almost like the world is puking in a sense at that. Like,
yes.
yeah, it's almost like it's a literal, like, I just want to guile and throw up at this idea that time and time again, this presentation, you see a serious problem, and the only thing that you can actually say is thoughts and prayers. And thoughts and prayers.
Yeah, exactly. It makes me sigh, and it's because, well, and to be fair, it's like, how is attacking thoughts and prayers doing something as well, right?
Yeah.
Well, it is an expression of outrage, and it's an expression of grief. But if we think that, like, taking to social media to attack thoughts and prayers is solving it in any way better than offering thoughts and prayers, it's like, well, okay, then who do you know and what are you doing and so on. But I feel like you have to start the conversation by legitimizing the pushback, and I want to do that.
Yeah, and I think, before we do that, I agree. I think it's very important as we get into this to acknowledge that part of it. But let's lead this in to the next question is maybe tell us a little bit what in your mind what prayer is and how you got to that point. So tell us a little bit. I think some people will know your journey, but many for those who don't will resonate with that. So tell us a little bit about because you have a very unique story.
Yeah, it has been a journey, and I think that if I summarize it in three parts, it'll make a lot of sense to folks about like what the problems are. They all appear in my life, actually. So I was raised in a Baptist home where my mother taught me to pray, and her prayers were very heartfelt. She prayed for all of our relatives by name every night, as did my grandmother, well into her 90s. And what they modeled for me is what we call intercession, and that is, primarily where you're asking God for help, especially on behalf of other people. So you could think of that as thoughts and prayers. However, in my own expression of that, I came to see that I was on this one end of the spectrum where I was like basically trying to manage the pain in the world because I was a sensitive person, and I was trying to manage that pain by managing God. And so I had a whole bookshelf, one row of my bookshelf on how to pray, because I wanted to know how can I make the world a better place by praying, and what are the things that make my prayers work, in quotation marks. And you've got like all these manuals on it, which is funny because Romans chapter 8 says we don't know how to pray. But these guys claim to know how to pray. And so on that end of the spectrum, you would get these faith movement folks that are saying, well, your prayers will work if you harness this power. And in some ways it's similar to New Age principles or the secret and so on. But they would say, like, you really need to be specific. So you can't just ask God for transportation. You have to ask him, like, I want this model of car, and it needs to be this color, and it needs to be this year. And I want a spouse, and here's my list of 10 things I'm looking for in a spouse and all. And what ends up happening, and especially if you really care about people and you're using intercession to pray for, let's say, loved ones who are sick or in a state of brokenness, when it doesn't appear to work, in other words, when my expectations are not fulfilled, it leads me to this disillusionment, and no wonder. And so I found myself in my spirit. I see a spiritual director once a month. It's sort of like a therapist, but it just means I'm not always in crisis when I go there. And we just talk things out. And I remember shouting in his office, God's not obeying me. and there it is, right? He made it safe enough for that darkness to come up. And then I understood, oh, I get it. My prayers are about telling God what to do. And when he doesn't do it the way I've said to do it, I resent him. And I actually had to fast from praying for a long time after that. That's part one. Any questions or comments to this point?
Maybe can you define for those who may not get it intercession?
Yeah, it's when you talk to God and you tell him what you want, basically. But especially it's a lot of it's about for other people. So, for example, right now I have people in my life who are struggling with cancer. So intercession would be when I go in prayer and I say, God, my friend is struggling with cancer. Would you please heal her? Or if I'm not that bold, I might say, would you give her strength to endure this trial? So you see, it's sort of like you're going on behalf of someone to ask for help or to ask for grace. And I think that's legit, but somehow I lapsed into a kind of Messiah complex about it, where this is up to me. And if I just pray right, then God should answer. And so in that sense, it's like I've created a technology of prayer, or like a vending machine. And what? Did I not put the right coins in? Or it's like an ATM, but I don't have the right PIN code. And it's like, come on, God. And I've said that a lot in my life. Come on, God. If and which raises the problem of pain and suffering in the world. If God is good and he loves us, and you see all this affliction around, and then you ask him to do something, shouldn't he do it? And I won't impose this on others or judge them, but I would say in my case, that's quite magical. I was treating it like I need the right incantation. I need to rub the genie's bottle right, so I'll get my 3 wishes and so on. And so the problem with that phase of my prayer life was self-will, I believe.
Yeah, and you said something interesting there in terms of magic, because I feel like part of the problem with this conversation of digging into prayer is there's something about it that's supposed to be magical. So, I don't have a car, but obviously, Brad, if you pray for me for a car, there's going to be one that's going to be right in front of my house, and it'll be awesome and great, and I'll be able to use it. And it's not, there's nothing like from what I read in scriptures that is necessarily, and when I study the miracles of Jesus, I don't look at them as magic. I think they've been promoted as magic, but I think that there's much more in that conversation around prayer. And I had a friend and I had an interesting conversation about this, and she suggested to me, in her opinion, that maybe it's not so much that we pray about the material stuff, but it's about real, tangible, personal stuff. I'm probably misquoting her in some way, but if you understand what I'm saying, it's not just so much about the materialistic stuff, but the heart stuff. Maybe.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you, or?
Yeah. I mean, so the model. Here's what I don't want to do is stray too far from what we get Jesus calling for in the Gospels. And
yeah.
So I get it. Like, I think almost you could multitask on this and say, okay, if I'm going to do intercession, if I'm going to pray for someone, maybe I can just ask for both and see what happens. Like, let's say, Lord, bless their heart, which it's funny. I was just in South Carolina where bless their heart is sort of like a curse, right? It's like F them. That's bless their heart. But if we might pray, bless their heart, and in fact, we might be a blessing to their heart. But I go ahead and I still ask God that, would you please deal with this tangible thing as well? And it's just that there's 2 problems with that. One is my track record is so low, where I'm like, for every time I pray for the sick, on a good run, I'm seeing 5%. The other problem is I'm seeing 5%. So I can't dismiss it as easily as those who've never seen an answer to prayer like that. I've seen 2 people legally blind get their sight back in front of me through prayer, and I'm like, what is that? And then you just go, okay, we're on to something, and then you go pray for a bunch more people, and nothing happens.
And nothing happens.
Well, wouldn't
right.
it be easier and more convenient to say either God never answers prayer? Oh, that's easy, and or maybe I could say, well, this is the other extreme I went to. I'll go into phase 2. The other extreme was I'm tired of asking. I'm disillusioned. I'm angry about it. I can't do that anymore. It hurts too much. I would rather just think about prayer in sort of an extreme contemplative version. And what I mean by that is I shifted. I swung the pendulum to this other platitude. Prayer doesn't change things, it just changes me. And so what I did was I learned how to compose prayers that could not disappoint me, prayers that involved no risk, prayers that Sure, God, change my heart, change my character, make me a more patient person. Fine, but I'm not going to stick my neck out. And what I noticed about that was it looks nothing like what Jesus talks about. he calls us to pray for, like, let your kingdom come, let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Well, what's that look like? But I couldn't go there anymore. I was in such pain at we saw a lot of devastation in 2008. A lot of my friends died. One was murdered. We had a number of overdoses in our fellowship. We had because we were working with people from the margins who have these real kind of problems. There was a bunch of suicides and all of that. Well, thoughts and prayers sounds stupid, and I'm having to do these funerals. So I retreated into this place of, like, I don't know that we're in this world, but I'm just gonna. So again, it was part of fasting from prayer, but then ultimately just saying, I don't want to prayers of faith, pray with any risk or expectation to my disappointed, disillusioned heart. And here's the thing, though, I spiritualized that. And so we called that contemplative prayer. We're just going to contemplate and be quiet and light a candle and kind of just be was the big thing, right? We're going to just be. Well, in some ways that was quite healing, and it was a detox from phase one. But it ultimately left me saying, well, what's the point then? Why bother praying at all? We're basically saying thoughts and prayers don't work. So I suppose it helps me calm down sometimes. And that's sort of the most I experienced of that phase.
Like
I don't know if your listeners would know that word contemplative prayer, but it's like coming to silence, and very similar to Buddhist breathing exercises, and you're mindful of yourself. It wouldn't risk the brilliance of it. You could pray with, and there is no God, but you could still sort of pray as a meditative exercise in self-soothing, and that has some value. It's just, is that prayer?
Yeah, like
maybe it's a kind of prayer.
I guess, yeah. What I think I want to ask you. You talked about answering prayer, God answering prayer. That's a big hit point. What do we mean when we say God answers prayer? Like, what do you like? Of course, obviously, just to update everyone, there is no car in front of my house. We're still not having that. But answering prayer, like let's, in the big thing, like, Lord, we pray that guns are no longer being used in the U.S. Like, how does, like, if we made that prayer, what do we expect in terms of an answer? Can we define that? And even in a smaller sense, when we talk about sickness, illness, job, like some of the basic, I don't want to say basic, sorry, maybe it's the wrong word, not basic, but some of our tangible real life stuff that we deal with every day, that we go to God for ourselves or for other people. What does the term answering prayer mean to you?
Oh, that's like a real. I see two sides to this. The first side, and which I've come to actually reject, is that we've thought of God answering prayer as God controlling the world in some way. And so you have even another slogan, God is in control. Well, watch the news tonight. Goodness gracious. Like, and we would have, it became one of these songs in church for a while. He is in control. And I'm thinking of the girl sitting behind me who's been molested repeatedly as a child. And she's saying, if God is in control, he's a bastard, Like, what is that about? And clearly he's not. Or you have what we call like this extreme sovereignty view, and you get parts of the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s, where they would say, oh yeah, God commands everything. And so even a rape, it's like, yes, You're like, okay, that's not God.
That's, yeah.
Whatever Satan is, that's,
Yeah,
you
it's
know,
this would, like,
but
wouldn't be something I would be interested in worshiping in any way, shape, or form.
no, hopefully you would hate him. And actually, they didn't require you to love such a God. They just wanted you to be afraid of him. And if they can make you afraid of that God, then they can control you. That was the thing. So I just say, let's just dismiss all of that for a moment and maybe say God doesn't do control. That's not love. If God is love, he doesn't do control, but then I would add, but he does care. Okay, what does that mean? And so then you go back to your question. What do answers to prayer look like? Well, A, they don't look like God controlling the world at your request. And I don't understand some of the sort of the atheist memes that are like, well, or objections. Well, like if there is a God, why doesn't he just end child molestation or rape or war? Well, what do you think he's supposed to do about that? Strap us down on gurneys? Like he doesn't. When we say he's not in control, I would say he doesn't control people. And if it was about that, he'd have to actually have us all in institutions. Because guess what? I've harmed people. And should he have prevented that? Why doesn't God prevent this or that? Obviously, there's no God if he doesn't prevent. Well, I guess if preventing means handcuffing me every time I have a harmful action, he could do that. So I just have to say, no, it's not about control. But then here it is, it's a real challenge. What does God's care look like in this world? And I would regard that as my answer to answers to prayer look like God's active caregiving in this world. And I went to listen to Bishop Desmond Tutu a few years ago. He was down in Tacoma. And he said this, I quote him in a more Christ-like God in the whole section on the book on God is shit happens, but God is good. That's a chapter in my book. And so he says word for word, he says, for whatever reason, okay, so it's a mystery, since humankind showed up on the scene, God does nothing in this world without a willing human partner. And it seems to me that's the front end of how God answers prayer, is that he finds willing human partners who will mediate his love into the world and empower that love. And so that's interesting, because I find some conservative Christians have a lot of trouble with that. It's like, what do you mean God does nothing in the world and without a willing human partner? It's like, well, people starve to death. I don't see manna falling from heaven. If starving people are going to get food tonight, it will be because somebody shared it with them and created mechanisms for getting it there. And we might say that's God. Well, you could also say, no, it's just people being humanitarians. My experience is that there are people who believe there is no God who are active in mediating love and care into the world, but I would see them as still they're partnering in something divine there. For my part, I that's what I bring to the table in prayer. It's like you talked about listening prayer in my intro. As I spend time in quiet and I listen to God, or call it the voice of deep wisdom if you want. I had a girlfriend in high school she's not a Christian now, but she's a professional psychologist, and she's kind of into the yoga thing and all that. And that's how she would describe it. When she quiets herself, she listens to the voice of deep wisdom. I'm calling that the voice of God. And then I also see this at work in prayer in the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Sex Addicts Anonymous, all of those things.
Right.
And they say this in step 11. Through prayer and meditation, we sought to improve our conscious contact with the God of our understanding, seeking only to do his will and the power to carry it out. And so what they're saying is that rather than self-will, we approach prayer through surrender, and we say, God, we become conscious of that if there is a God, I'll say if, because it's a faith statement. You don't prove there's a God. That's silly.
Yeah.
But if there's a God, that God is love. And if you want to know what that love looks like, in my case, I've looked to Jesus and how he showed us what a willing human being surrendered to the love of God does in this world. And he just tells you, they feed hungry people, they clothe naked people, they welcome refugees and immigrants, they visit people in hospitals, doesn't even say heal them, and they visit prisoners in prison. And so he's giving these examples of that is God's loving care in the world. And the weird thing is he flips it. He doesn't say, when you do these things, you're being God in the world. Actually, what he says, when you do things, you're doing this to God in the world. God is hungry in the hungry. He's naked in the naked. He's imprisoned in the prisoners. And so this is an odd turn of events, you know.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. Because I think a lot of this, I'm not going to speak for everybody, but I feel like a lot of this conversation around prayer working, we're answering, non-answer, is around what I view the characteristics. I think that there's a general consensus and agreement that Jesus was a nice person. Jesus was really spread love, message, hope, grace. I think most people, when they read the story of Jesus, would generally agree with that statement. Now, he did say some tough things at times. He did turn tables in temples, and he said some really rough stuff to some people. We can get into that. But I feel like the character of God and how it has been represented in big world, specifically in the conservative Christian mindset, has caused a lot of damage within this topic. Would you agree with that?
You think?
No duff, Kevin. No duff.
Yeah, I mean, you've got guys like Gandhi, who he literally read the Sermon on the Mount. This is Jesus' primary sermon on how you basically about living the golden rule with our neighbors and living nonviolent resistance to the powers that doesn't escalate violence. And so Gandhi's reading this sermon prayerfully every day. And so he's completely inspired by the message and ministry of Jesus, who, by the way, wasn't crucified for being a nice guy, you know?
No.
But then he said, like, here's the problem is I just don't see Christians practicing this. And in fact, now we have Christians who've made it a moral responsibility to do the opposite of what Jesus says there. Like, it's not just like we're getting away with this and disobeying Jesus about, let's say, welcoming immigrants and refugees. We're actually going to make it our moral duty. Or another one would be like, it's your moral duty to kill your enemy in these situations. When Jesus is like, no, you love your enemy, and in fact you pray for your enemy. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Prayer again. You bless your enemy. What? You turn the other cheek and what he's doing though is he taught us a way that's not just idealistic and naive. He taught us how to live prayer in this world in a way that inspired Tolstoy, inspired Gandhi, inspired Martin Luther King Jr. And what do you know? Sometimes it even is effective and not nearly so naive as like, well, we'll take matters into our own hands and we'll get our license to carry a concealed weapon because we're good Christians.
Yeah.
I get it. You're going to kill someone in your house. Maybe you have a home invasion, but let's not make this a sort of like a moral virtue in the name of Christ. That's crazy,
Yeah.
That kind of was a tangent, but maybe not.
No, I think it's hitting on, I think, the pain. I feel like we're hitting the pain because
Okay.
from what I'm seeing, maybe I'm different. I don't know, but I feel like there's a certain yeah. I mean, just this sort of this moral almost hypocrisy. I mean, in one sense, like I tweeted this out, like, how can some of them read the words of Jesus and like just have such a callous lack of care from human people?
Yeah.
Like I just, it's confusing to me to see that, like how do you live that way? How can you proclaim Jesus on one hand with the Bible in one hand and have such a lack of care for humans in another? Like it's tough to reconcile for me as a Christian. I can't reconcile it.
Yeah. I see your problem. You're trying to get your head around insanity. It doesn't work
It
that
doesn't work.
way.
Yes.
It's hypocritical, and this is where Christ was harsh with people. He never once, um, denounces uh, those who were regarded as immoral. Even like, I mean, what he did was he said, "I'll tell you what's immoral. Immoral is religious hypocrisy, and that's what's immoral." And so he could be quite sharp with those guys. Now we're in a slightly more complicated times right now because here's what I'm observing: we've got folks on the I'll use the I'll talk about spectrum politics. I think the whole spectrum of right and left, the whole thing is a matrix of groupthink, and we need to repent. If you can find yourself anywhere on the spectrum easily, you've probably bought into some kind of groupthink, and that's what we need to get off of. But the reason why I mention that is because you've got these self-righteous, hateful people on the right, and I mean they really are like overtly. And then I see some of them. I see some of them have abandoned that, especially when they've abandoned it in a lot of pain, and they're like, "Wow, that system really abused me." So they switch sides, and now they're on the progressive left. Except, wait, they're still hateful and self-righteous.
Hmm.
So they switch sides without switching spirits, and you've got a fundamentalist left. It's like, how do you have a fundamentalist left? Well, it's sort of like um, I you can end up changing your let's say your politics without changing your character. And this is again where I think the importance of prayer is enormous. If we want to speak up for justice, how do we do that in a way where we don't become the new bully and become the unjust one in how we do things in the name of justice? Well, we need to have some level of transformation on the inside so that we're not just red-eyed angry activists who are spewing kind of condemnation the same way we did when we were on the right. It's like,
Yeah.
you're still in the matrix, come out.
Yeah. It's condemnation is condemnation no matter where it comes from.
Yeah, and the thing is, if it's rooted in, I mean, these deep wounds, then give rise to resentment, and resentment grows into malice, and malice grows into vengeance, and vengeance grows into violence. And now I think a helpful word is like, are we going to make things right through retribution? Right? So you can have someone who really wants to make things right, but if you don't get retribution out of your heart, then you will just be the next perpetrator of injustice. And I say that as a confession. I mean, even right now, I kind of feel like vengeful. So, like, what's going on with that, right? So, my friend, I have this friend from Australia. He's a really profound activist, Jared McKenna, and he taught me something last month. I saw him, and he said calling out. He said it this way: in the in activist culture, calling out is easy. Calling in is much harder. And that's what you see in someone like, when you read Martin Luther King Jr.'s writings or listen to his sermons, or Nelson Mandela, he is not perpetrating the us-them thing. These guys rise above the us-them. It's easy to call someone out on Facebook or on Instagram or whatever, right? That's easy. Anyone can do that.
Yeah.
And actually maybe we should sometimes, but the harder work that leads to a just society is the work of calling people in, calling people who are on the other side of the table, and say, well, let's at least meet at the table and work through the hurt. And I feel like most people, right or left, if you're having a religious or a political argument with them, if there's, or let's call it a disagreement, if any anger comes up at all, one thing to look for underneath that is that they really, really do think they're trying to be faithful. And if you can tap into that and say, we may disagree, but I see that you're trying to be faithful to your convictions, and and so am I. So maybe we could have a talk. Of course, there are those who weren't trying to be faithful, and that's who Jesus is critiquing, and probably like some of the legislators right now, it has nothing to do with faithfulness, and maybe there's not a meeting point with folks like that other than pressure.
Yeah, politics and power and money and all of those things that makes people feel comfortable and there's no pressure. Like, in the big scheme of things, I think what we're looking at in the US, from where I'm sitting, I think the first time that I have actually legitimately felt any pressure on the Republicans or the lobbyists or the politicians in the US to make any change has been these kids in Parkland calling out. And I mean, we can have a whole debate on, oh, that was nice. We'd have a whole
That was a harp on my phone. Sorry about that.
That's all good. It had some peace. Yeah. Calling out to, challenging these politicians about where they're getting their money from. Now, you can debate how they're doing it. You can debate the tone. I really don't. They're just speaking straight from the heart. And I feel like that's the first time I have legitimately, watching a little bit of the town hall, I felt like Marco Rubio was squirming a bit. And I think that's where we're seeing the action behind prayer is, that's where I guess I see how prayer weirdly works, is when you actually see a tangible change in a human being where something has affected them. I think that's where it works most.
Yeah.
Like the inside you were talking about. Yeah. And Jesus talks a lot about the inside when you pray. Like, I mean, he blasts the hypocrites and talks about pray about character. He blasts the imagery of prayer and go back into the closet and pray. I don't care what you're like. If Eugene Peterson had a new way to translate it, it'd be the Facebook International version. Don't pray on Facebook. Go off of Facebook and pray there.
Yeah, and then to see thought prayers as something, not as a shield against the kids down in Florida, but actually, like, what if we actually prayed for them in this sense? God, give them the courage to stand up against injustice and to speak against the power. So you give me insight into how I can help. Help us to oppose the monster without becoming monsters, or to treat others as monsters. This is bigger than individuals, and so some of that, I think, like, to back their cause with prayer instead of make it a way to derail it or dismiss it. It's also a little different, I think, between the kids there and me in this way. these are the actual victims, and we need to empower their voices. And I feel like they need to be allowed to grieve and to scream and to march and to, like, you don't shut down that kind of grief. And but in my case, I need to, if I'm a third party observer, it's very easy for me to side with them against Rubio, for example, and be self-righteous about it. It's like, wait a minute, I'm older than Rubio is, and I'm living up in Canada, and what is this? What is this outrage I'm feeling? What is this condescension and so on? And so the trick for me, I think, and this also came from Jared McKenna, is then I need to think about ways in which I'm complicit. The kids don't need to think about that. They're the ones that were hiding in closets and dragging their, corpses around. I'm sitting up here in an armchair in front of my social media screen, and like, okay, maybe the front end for me is to examine my own complicity to these kind of things, where I, without perhaps directly causing any of it, I enjoy the benefits of being a middle-aged white guy.
Right. Yeah.
and confessing that, right? And like, how could we let this happen? But we did. We actually, So again, what I'm trying to do there is to say, I don't want to go to the very. It's just an easy move to take up condemnation and to be blind to my own issues.
Yeah. And that's kind of been why I've been wanting to dig in a little bit more, because I feel like I'm going around this circle and circle and circle, and we're saying the same. I feel like I'm saying the same thing over and over again, and I'm not actually. Am I actually being productive?
Yeah. Is what I'm doing any better than throwing up thoughts and prayers, right?
Yeah, that's
there's an easier place to see my complicity.
Yeah.
What are my platitudes? How do I express them? Is this about just making myself look good on social media by saying the right thing? And like, oh my goodness.
Yeah. It's been it's tough, because I can get, I don't know, I just like, am I actually using this tragedy to advance my social media career?
Yeah.
That sounds horrible to say, but a legitimate question I have to ask myself.
Yeah.
And
here you are, like, saying it publicly. So,
yeah.
Good on you. We have, like, one of the critiques of the media, and that would include then the social media, is we may not love the tragedy, but we love the press. Oh, good, we have a topic for this week, and all of that, right? And now I don't want to be too hard on. I don't want to be too hard on us, in the sense that these are important issues that need voicing right now. But the question stands, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like, what are we doing right now? So,
and in 2 weeks, when the news cycle goes on to what Trump said, where's this conversation? And this is where I feel, and I'm sorry, I'm going on a tangent, maybe, or a little bit of a soapbox, but this is where I feel we have failed on that sense, and why I don't feel that there's been a lot of pressure is because in times when this is not a topic, and maybe this speaks to prayer as well, it's not brought up. So when we talk about this issue, it feels to me like it is only around the tragedy, and not when it's not a tragedy that's in the news. Now, we know that there's a bunch of shootings in the U.S. I think that some had it at 18 up to the first 45 days of 2018. But at the same time, when this is not a topic, mainstream topic, and I'm using air quote, are we actually talking about it, and what's that conversation like? Same with mental health, same with a bunch of other things. When it's not trendy to talk about it, we don't talk about it. And I don't know if we're doing any service to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is part of it's like if our faith is relevant whatsoever, then it needs to wade into this stuff. So fair enough, right?
Yeah.
We are wading into it, and again, like, so what is where does prayer fit in all this? Well, again, it's then like, okay, that God works in this world, caring through willing human partners. So perhaps then this episode can be an answer to prayer in that sense. We are willing human partners to perhaps the groans of God about this stuff in a world where he doesn't strap people down to gurneys or prevent authentic otherness. But when our authentic otherness is death dealing, then giving voice to the groans around that, and even to the helplessness of prayer when you can't. My prayers don't strap down Rubio, but perhaps my prayers empower young people who will give him a moment of clarity.
Mm-hmm.
And in that moment, there can be a breakthrough, and that I might ascribe to God.
Yeah. Let's talk about your book
Mm-hmm.
and your journey there.
Okay.
A
So a more Christ-like God.
Yeah.
What I'm saying there, and it's all the more poignant now in the light of the ways that evangelicalism as a movement in America has discredited Christianity, probably fatally so. And what's going on there is we've got false images of God competing. And so in my book, I just mention a few of these false images of God, and they're so toxic because the God you believe in then inevitably trickles down to how you live in this world. So some of the one toxic image of God is the God who is angry, and he's the punishing judge and full of wrath, and this needs to be appeased somehow. He's the God who sends people to eternal conscious torment in a lake of fire, and he's the God who had to like sacrifice his own child through torture and death to sort of before he could forgive anyone. So the opposite image that's also toxic, the God who is distant and silent, and he's the absentee landlord or the deadbeat dad who just sort of left when we needed him, and he's disappeared from the world and he's nowhere. And then a third version of that would be this God you can manipulate, like I was talking about with the genie in the bottle, or the sort of the, what do you call that? A doting grandparent, and
Yeah.
just ask anything you want, and he'll give it until he doesn't.
Yeah.
You just come sit on his knee and ask him, and sure, it'll be under the tree, and then it's not, the gift's not under the tree, and you're mad. And where I go from there then is I say, but God's not like that. God is like Jesus. God's exactly like Jesus. And so this is the claim of the New Testament is that God is love enfleshed in this person, the nature of God to be self-giving, radically forgiving, co-suffering love. So a God who gives himself to the world, in fact submits himself to our abuse, and yet instead of pouring out his wrath and sending devastation, forgives even from the cross, and then co-suffering, meaning that that from there he is in solidarity with the victims of this world, and so that's what Jesus came to show us about God, which is like virtually the opposite of Zeus, and actually virtually the opposite of American civil religion with its thin veneer of Jesus talk. And that God is not about militarism and death dealing and judgment. It's about rescuing us from that like spiral, but we don't like it very much. We would rather keep our hatred and so on. So it's not going very well when we don't emulate love, and when we make projections of God in our own angry image, for example. The God who's carrying the AR-15, wrapped in a flag and so on. And that this has become the face of Christianity so often in the world. And like, no wonder people want to ditch that.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't. I have trouble with it, and I mean it's that whole image even of like the white-haired grandpa-ish God with the biblical robe, sitting on a throne, and even the Jesus with the hippie hair and the beard, and with the arms wide and it's not. I mean, it's been a traditional image, but I don't know if it's a real image. And I mean, in a lot of Christian circles, there's been people poking at that. Specifically, William Paul Young took a lot of heat when he wrote The Shack and poked at that image a little bit, and people got very angry at that, in a sense.
Oh yeah, in fact, it was such a The Shack was such a brilliant book because what it does is so the first layer of rejection was that God could show up as a black woman, and I just want to say, you know what, that objection was ruined, but there's a deeper level of resistance to it, and that is that Paul was actually saying God is love, and that he's not into wrath, and that we're already so broken. He doesn't need to punish broken. You don't heal AIDS by punishing someone. You have to. We need a great physician who can heal us at a level of woundedness. Well, if you have an emotional commitment to othering people and then condemning them and wrathing them through your image of God, then Paul is not. And so he's completely faithful to the vision of the early church. So if we're going to have a vision of God, I've really, part of me being part of the Orthodox Church is going back to the very these church fathers and mothers who compiled the Bible and who gave us doctrine. And what they said is God is not literally wrathful or angry, and to literalize that as if he's a punisher is blasphemy, and it's idolatry. And so what that tells me is we've created this idol of the angry God. And so when an atheist comes along and says, I reject that idol, and that worship at that point.
Yeah.
You should reject that.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, who's gobbling this up? Broken people are reading The Shack. People on death row are reading The Shack. New Age conferences are bringing in Paul because his God is more personal and loving than sort of their image, and it's quite amazing.
Yeah. How can people find these books?
You could go to bradjersak.com for some of my books, but they're all on Amazon, and especially a more Christ-like God you could get from either Amazon or ptm.org. ptm.org is probably, you'll probably get the best deal there, and that's also where you'll find other resources. Like we've got a magazine on there called CWRM. It's Christianity Without the Religion magazine.
Right. Oh yeah. Let's
PDF
talk. Yeah.
What's that?
There's a Facebook group with that you moderate. Christianity Without Religion.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. But that always just links you back to ptm.org, and people can join conversations there, but yeah, what we're defining. I do believe it's the religious practices like praying, but what we're defining religion there as earning our way to heaven through jumping through religious hoops. And we're saying it's not about that. In fact, the Orthodox, even for all their robes and incense and candles, one of our priests said this, that religion is a neurological disorder and living faith is the cure. And so we're hoping that people aren't just going to to bail on faith because religion has screwed it up so badly. So for those still interested in pursuing that and looking for an anchor rather than just wandering off, maybe ptm.org has something for you.
Is there anything else that you would like to cover?
No, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much. One thing I will recommend, if you want to Google Jersak, Jersak, that's my last name, Jersak, and chairs and Denver. Google Jersak chairs in Denver. I do a 30-minute talk on there that we call The Gospel in Chairs. And it's just about, I tell the story about how we used to talk about and the problems with that. And then I shift into an upgrade to how we talk about God, where the bottom line is that God is always for you, that he always loves you. He's in pursuit of you. And it's not about how good you are or your ability to outrun him. It's just mercy that endures forever. And so I do want to say, just in closing, that's sort of my primary prayer these days is I just say, Lord, have mercy. I see the news and I say, Lord, have mercy. And maybe that helps me be a little more merciful that I pray that so much. But also maybe that's a prayer he could answer. And in the sense of, okay, I can send mercy. I can send young people to the legislature. I can send good folks into Syria to help with the crisis there. I can alleviate suffering in this world through merciful people. So go ahead, pray, Lord, have mercy. And that's where I've come out on it.
Yes, I think that's a good way to pray. Good way to pray. This has been enlightening. I think that we went through the minefield, and I think we'll let it land here. We'll see where people go. We're going to have more conversations about this because I do feel it's an important topic. And I think even for the Christian church, I dare say that I think it's time we have a really good talk about prayer. So I think we hit some things here. And if it touched a nerve, it touched a nerve. As a friend of mine said, I said what I said. Don't take it back. Follow me on Facebook. You have me as a friend, Kevin Olenek. Twitter at KEVOLE. SoundCloud.com, KEVOLE. Spreaker.com, KEVOLE. YouTube, Kevin Olenek. I do have a Patreon account, KEVOLE as well. If you check that out and want to become a Patreon, great. Thanks for joining us, Brad.
Thanks so much for having me. It was an interesting conversation. Appreciate it.
Yes. And we will talk to you all very soon. We have another one coming up a little bit later today where I interview Kieran Sweeney on his book called Thoughts. Check that out soon. Bye for now.